Have you ever felt that invisible weight dragging upon your soul, as if certain presences in your life were slowly dimming your inner light? That peculiar emptiness that comes not from being alone, but from being surrounded by the wrong people? I remember walking through a crowded street last autumn, every face passing by a blur, when suddenly I realized I had been carrying this same heaviness for years. The weight wasn't my own spirit, but the accumulated burden of relationships that had long stopped nurturing my authentic self. Perhaps you felt it too, that subtle knowing that certain connections in your life have become spiritual anchors rather than sails. Walt Whitman, that great cosmic poet who saw the divine breathing through every blade of grass and every human heart, understood this profound truth about spiritual relationships better than most. He recognized that while the soul longs for connection, not all connections serve the soul's expansion. In his journey through the spiritual wilderness of America, Whitman discovered that true spiritual liberation often begins with a necessary abandonment, not of responsibility, but of relationships that confine rather than free us. Today, I'm going to share with you Whitman's most transformative insight about the 6 types of people he believed we must spiritually abandon to reclaim our authentic divine nature. This isn't about rejection or condemnation. Whitman embraced all humanity in his cosmic vision. Rather, it's about recognizing when certain relationships have fulfilled their purpose in our spiritual evolution, and when holding on to them keeps us from the greater communion that awaits. The wisdom I'm about to share transformed my understanding of spiritual relationships so profoundly that I found myself breathing more freely, thinking more clearly, and loving more authentically than I had in decades. These aren't just concepts, they're keys to unlocking a more expansive way of being in relationship with yourself, others, and the divine universe that Whitman celebrated so eloquently. Let me tell you about a woman I met in a small coastal town 3 years ago. Her name was Eleanor, and when I first saw her, she was standing alone by the shoreline, watching the waves with eyes that seemed to hold both wonder and profound sadness. When we eventually spoke, she told me she had spent 15 years in relationships that required her to make herself smaller, to dim her light, to speak less of her visions and dreams. "I have everyone I thought I wanted," she confided, "but I've lost the person I was meant to be." Her words struck me deeply because I recognized in them the essential conflict Whitman addresses in his understanding of spiritual companionship. Eleanor had surrounded herself with people who could not hold space for her full expression, the very people Whitman would have urged her to compassionately release from her life. Whitman's vision of spiritual relationships wasn't about isolation or rejection. It was about creating space for authentic communion. He believed that the divine flows freely through unobstructed souls, and certain relationships create obstructions not because they're bad, but because they've served their purpose in our journey and now block the way forward. What made Whitman's understanding of spiritual relationships so revolutionary was his recognition that we aren't meant to journey with the same souls throughout our entire spiritual evolution. Some companions are meant only for certain segments of the path. Recognizing when a relationship has completed its spiritual purpose requires not judgment, but discernment, a quality Whitman possessed in abundance beneath his cosmic enthusiasm. The abandonment Whitman speaks of isn't about cutting people off coldly, but about compassionately releasing attachments to relationships that no longer serve the highest expression of who you're becoming. It's about recognizing that true love sometimes means allowing greater distance, creating boundaries, or even complete separation when the relationship constrains rather than expands your soul. This is what Eleanor had to learn, not to reject others, but to stop rejecting herself by remaining in connections that required her spiritual diminishment. The most powerful secret Whitman discovered about spiritual relationships isn't just in his words, but in the way he lived, fully present, authentically expressed, and free from the need to contort his spirit to accommodate relationships that couldn't embrace his vastness. Today, I'm going to reveal Whitman's most liberating vision about the specific types of people we must compassionately release from our lives, and how this conscious abandonment actually opens us to a deeper communion with humanity and the divine cosmos he saw pulsing through all things. I invite you now to breathe deeply and open yourself to this wisdom that might challenge you, but that holds the potential to set your spirit free in ways you've been longing for, perhaps without even knowing it. I want to pause for a moment here and speak directly to your experience with the people in your life. There's something intimate I'd like to ask you, something I've been reflecting on deeply since I first encountered Whitman's perspective on spiritual relationships. When was the last time you felt truly seen and accepted in your full spiritual essence by another person? That rare moment when you didn't need to hide any part of your spiritual journey, your doubts, your unconventional beliefs, or your deepest questions. Take a breath and allow yourself to feel, not think about, what arises in your heart as you consider this. I know that for many of you, this experience of being truly witnessed in your spiritual nature is painfully rare. Perhaps you've never shared your deepest spiritual insights, because who could possibly understand something so profound and personal? But here, in this moment, I want you to know that your authentic spiritual experience is honored, even those aspects that the people closest to you might dismiss or invalidate. If something resonates within you, if you feel moved to share an aspect of your spiritual journey that has remained unexpressed, the comments below are a sacred space for your voice. Your words might be exactly what another soul needs to read today, a confirmation that they aren't alone in their experience. Complete this phrase if it calls to you. The relationship that most constrains my spiritual expansion has taught me that, one son. Or simply share which of the 6 types of people we're discussing today resonates most with your current journey. And if you prefer to hold your reflections in the silence of your heart, know that this too is a profound honoring of your unique path. Now let's explore the first type of person Whitman believed we must compassionately release from our lives: the spiritual diminisher. These are people who consistently make your spiritual experience feel small, invalid, or foolish. Whitman himself faced countless spiritual diminishers in his time, those who couldn't comprehend his cosmic vision, or who actively mocked his spiritual expressions. In Song of Myself, he writes about those who would belittle the soul's expansive nature. They do not know how immortal, but I know. The spiritual diminisher often appears benign, even caring. They might say things like, "I'm just concerned about how much time you spend in meditation," or, "Don't you think all this talk about energy and consciousness is a bit much?" They question your spiritual practices not from genuine curiosity, but from a place of discomfort with spiritual depth. These people often feel threatened by authentic spiritual exploration because it reminds them of their own unaddressed spiritual questions. Their diminishment comes not always from malice, but from fear. Fear of the vast cosmic questions that Whitman fearlessly embraced. What makes spiritual diminishers particularly difficult to recognize is that they often love us in other ways. They may support our careers, our practical decisions, even our emotional needs, while consistently undermining our spiritual unfoldment. This partial love creates a painful conflict, as we feel both supported and stunted by the same person. Whitman would say that love which cannot embrace your soul's expansion is incomplete love. The spiritual liberation that comes from compassionately releasing spiritual diminishers from your inner circle is not about rejecting them as people, but about protecting the sacred space of your spiritual growth. It might mean creating new boundaries, reducing certain interactions, or simply not sharing your spiritual journey with them anymore. This isn't selfishness. It's a recognition that your spiritual development isn't negotiable. It's the essential journey of your life. The second type is what Whitman would call the spiritual competitor. These are people who turn spiritual growth into a subtle contest, who need to be more evolved, more awakened, or more conscious than others around them. Whitman abhorred spiritual hierarchy and competition. He saw the divine flowing equally through the learned professor and the untutored child, through the church elder and the spiritual seeker who communes with God in nature. In Leaves of Grass, he celebrates the divine without levels or ranks. I hear and behold God in every object, yet understand God not in the least. The spiritual competitor might speak of unity and oneness, but their actions reveal a constant need to position themselves above others on some imagined spiritual ladder. They collect spiritual experiences, teachings, and practices not primarily for growth but for spiritual status. They might subtly dismiss your insights with phrases like, "Oh, I moved beyond that understanding years ago," or "That's a good starting point, but when you reach where I am," their presence in your life creates an atmosphere of judgment and comparison precisely where there should be none. in the sacred unfolding of your unique spiritual journey. What makes spiritual competitors particularly toxic is how they distort the very nature of spiritual growth, turning what should be an expansive, inclusive journey into a narrow, exclusive contest. They transform the infinite mystery that Whitman revered into a finite game with winners and losers. This fundamentally misunderstands spirituality, which is never about being better than, but about being more authentically present to the wonder of existence. Releasing spiritual competitors from your inner circle isn't about declaring them wrong. It's about creating a spiritual environment around yourself that aligns with the truth of what spirituality actually is. Not a ladder to climb above others, but a vast field in which to encounter the divine alongside others. The third type Whitman would urge us to release is the spiritual bypasser. These people use spiritual concepts to avoid facing life's authentic challenges, difficult emotions, or responsibilities. They employ phrases like, "Everything happens for a reason," or "just focus on the positive," to dismiss very real human struggles that need to be acknowledged and integrated. Whitman, for all his cosmic joy, never bypassed the full human experience. He wrote unflinchingly about death, suffering, sexuality, and injustice. In The Wound Dresser, he describes tending to horrifically wounded Civil War soldiers with both spiritual perspective and unflinching presence. He didn't spiritualize away their suffering. He sat with it, touched it, validated its reality while still holding a larger perspective. Spiritual bypassers often appear highly evolved because of their ability to maintain a facade of perpetual peace and positivity. They may criticize you for being too caught up in human drama or feeding negative energy when you're simply being honest about your human experience. They confuse transcendence with avoidance, mistaking spiritual maturity for emotional bypassing. Their presence in your life can make you doubt the validity of your own emotional responses and human struggles. You might begin to hide your challenges, pretending to a spiritual perfection that no embodied being can maintain. What makes spiritual bypassers particularly damaging is how they separate spirituality from embodied human reality, creating a false split that Whitman's entire body of work sought to heal. For Whitman, the soul wasn't separate from the body. Joy wasn't separate from sorrow. And spiritual realization didn't mean escaping human experience, but embracing it more fully. By compassionately creating distance from spiritual bypassers, you reclaim the integrity of your full human experience. You create space to develop a spirituality that encompasses rather than escapes your humanity, the integrated spirituality that Whitman embodied and celebrated. The fourth type of person Whitman would advise us to release is the spiritual narcissist. Unlike the spiritual competitor who needs to be higher on the ladder than others, the spiritual narcissist believes they are the ladder itself. These individuals position themselves as uniquely gifted spiritual channels, teachers, or guides whose personal spiritual revelations somehow supersede traditional wisdom, community discernment, or even your own direct spiritual experience. Whitman, despite his cosmic self-celebration, maintained profound humility about the ultimate mystery. In When I Heard the Learned Astronomer, he reminds us that direct experience of the stars themselves trumps any expert's lecture about them. The spiritual narcissist often begins phrases with, "The universe told me to tell you," or "I'm receiving a direct download about your situation." They position themselves as the essential intermediary between you and spiritual truth, between you and the divine. While genuine spiritual guidance and mentorship can be valuable, the spiritual narcissist crosses the line into making themselves necessary for your spiritual connection. They may become troubled or offended when you seek guidance elsewhere, or trust your own inner knowing over their pronouncement. What makes spiritual narcissists particularly difficult to recognize is that they often possess genuine charisma and even certain spiritual gifts. They may indeed have insights or abilities that seem impressive. The problem isn't their gifts, but how they use them to create spiritual dependency rather than spiritual autonomy. Whitman believed that each person had direct, unmediated access to the divine. In Song of Myself, he proclaims, "Divine am I inside and out, and I make holy whatever I touch or am touched from." By compassionately limiting the influence of spiritual narcissists in your life, you reclaim your direct relationship with the divine, exactly as Whitman would have wanted. You remember that while teachers and guides have their place, No one stands between you and your own sacred connection to the cosmos. The fifth type Whitman would urge us to release is the spiritual consumer. These people approach spirituality as a marketplace from which to acquire experiences, credentials, and exotic practices without the commitment to integration or depth. They collect spiritual modalities like fashionable accessories, constantly moving to the next workshop, teacher, or technique, without allowing any practice to transform them at the root. Whitman was suspicious of superficial spirituality. He sought the divine not in exotic locales or special ceremonies, but in the ordinary miracle of existence. "A leaf of grass is no less than the journey work of the stars," he wrote. The spiritual consumer often speaks in excited terms about their latest spiritual acquisition. "You have to try this new meditation technique," or "I just got certified in this amazing healing modality." Their spiritual journey resembles a shopping spree more than a committed path. While exploration certainly has its place, the spiritual consumer never allows themselves to be fundamentally challenged or changed by what they encounter. What makes spiritual consumers particularly depleting as companions is how they trivialize the sacred through constant consumption without digestion. Their presence can pull you into a similarly superficial approach, constantly seeking the new and exciting rather than deepening into practices that might initially seem ordinary but contain unlimited depth when fully engaged. Whitman found infinity in a blade of grass, in the face of a stranger, in the simplest aspects of existence. By compassionately creating distance from spiritual consumers in your life, you protect your capacity for depth and commitment. You create space to discover what Whitman knew, that spiritual depth comes not from accumulating more and more experiences, but from fully inhabiting the ones you already have. The sixth and final type of person Whitman would advise us to release is what we might call the spiritual condemner. These individuals use spiritual or religious principles as weapons of judgment, shame, and exclusion. They've transformed the expansive mystery of the divine into a narrow set of rules that conveniently position themselves on the right side and cast others into spiritual deficiency or danger. Whitman rebelled against this constricted spirituality throughout his work. In To Him That Was Crucified, he writes of a spirituality where all shall yet be forfeited, a communion beyond the artificial boundaries of dogma and judgment. The spiritual condemner often uses phrases like God's plan to validate their personal judgment, or speaks with absolute certainty about who is saved or enlightened and who remains in spiritual darkness. They may express concern for your soul, while actually diminishing your spiritual autonomy and unique path. Their spiritual vocabulary is filled with absolutes: always, never, right, wrong, saved, damned, pure, impure. What makes spiritual condemners particularly harmful is how they invert the essential nature of true spirituality. While authentic spirituality expands our capacity for compassion, inclusion, and understanding, the spiritual condemner uses spiritual language to justify the opposite: exclusion, judgment, and rigidity. This profound contradiction creates a toxic spiritual environment that can damage your relationship not only with others, but with your own spiritual nature. By compassionately limiting the influence of spiritual condemners in your life, you protect your conception of the divine from being reduced to a cosmic judge keeping score. You create space to discover what Whitman knew, that the divine mystery encompasses all, judges little, and forever expands our capacity for love rather than contracting it through fear. Now that we've explored these 6 types of people that Whitman would advise us to compassionately release from our lives, you might be wondering, how do I actually go about this abandonment in a way that honors both myself and others? This is where Whitman's nuanced understanding of spiritual relationships becomes especially valuable. For Whitman, the goal was never isolation, but authentic communion. The release of certain relationships makes space for truer connections. First, recognize that abandonment rarely means complete severance, especially with family or long-standing relationships. It most often means creating new boundaries, limiting certain types of interactions, or changing your expectations. With the spiritual diminisher, for instance, you might decide not to share your spiritual insights with them anymore, while maintaining connection in other areas where the relationship still nurtures you. With the spiritual bypasser, you might gently but firmly insist on the validity of your human struggles, when they attempt to gloss over them with spiritual platitudes. Second, approach this release with genuine compassion, both for yourself and the other person. Understand that people who manifest these spiritual relationship patterns are usually acting from their own wounds, fears, and limited understanding. Their behavior reflects their current capacity, not their permanent nature or value as being. Whitman held even those he disagreed with in a larger compassion. "I am the man, I suffered, I was there," he wrote of his ability to inhabit others' experience. Third, make this a process of gradual discernment rather than reactive cutting off. Notice the subtle energy dynamics in your relationships. When do you feel spiritually expanded in someone's presence? When do you feel contracted? Let these bodily and energetic responses guide you toward relationships that truly nurture your soul's expression. Finally, fill the space created by this compassionate release with relationships that reflect the spiritual communion Whitman celebrated. Connections based on mutual respect for each person's direct relationship with the divine, free from comparison, judgment, dependency, or diminishment. Remember Eleanor, whom I mentioned at the beginning? Her journey didn't involve dramatically cutting people off. Instead, she began by recognizing how certain relationships had required her spiritual diminishment. She started creating gentle boundaries, declining some family gatherings that had always left her feeling spiritually depleted, limiting conversations with certain friends to areas where genuine connection was possible, and most importantly, finding new companions who could witness and celebrate her authentic spiritual unfolding. "I haven't abandoned anyone," she told me a year later. "I've just stopped abandoning myself." The challenges you'll face in releasing these 6 types of spiritual relationships are both practical and internal. On the practical level, these individuals may not understand your need for distance or changed boundaries. The spiritual diminisher might claim you've become too sensitive. The spiritual narcissist may suggest you're making a grave mistake by trusting your own guidance instead of theirs. The spiritual condemner might imply you're on a dangerous path by seeking a more expansive spirituality. These external reactions, while difficult, are often easier to navigate than the internal challenges you'll face. You may struggle with guilt, wondering if you're being selfish or unfair. You may question whether you have the right to prioritize your spiritual well-being over established relationship patterns. You may fear loneliness if these relationships have been central in your life, even if they've constrained your spiritual growth. Here, Whitman's words offer profound reassurance. Not I, not anyone else can travel that road for you. You must travel it for yourself. Whitman understood that the journey toward authentic spiritual communion sometimes requires traveling alone for certain stretches of the path. The temporary solitude, while challenging, creates space for new, more authentic connections to emerge. What helps most in facing these challenges is remembering that by releasing relationships that constrain your spiritual nature, you're not just serving yourself, you're serving the greater integrity of what relationships are meant to be. You're refusing to participate in connection patterns that diminish, rather than celebrate the divine in each person. This isn't selfish. It's a stand for what's true about authentic spiritual communion. The transformation that becomes possible when you compassionately release these 6 types of people from your spiritual inner circle is both subtle and profound. At first, you might simply notice a sense of relief, the lightening of an invisible burden you've carried for so long that you stopped recognizing its weight. You might find yourself breathing more deeply, thinking more clearly, and feeling more emotionally honest than you have in years. As this initial unburdening settles, a new quality of discernment often emerges. You become more attuned to the energetic reality of relationships rather than just their surface appearance. You can sense more quickly and clearly when an interaction expands your spirit and when it constrains it. This discernment isn't judgment, it's simply accurate perception of energetic reality. With continued practice in maintaining these healthier spiritual boundaries, many people experience what we might call a reclamation of spiritual sovereignty. You remember that your relationship with the divine is direct and unmediated, requiring no one's validation or permission. You recover the confidence to trust your own spiritual experiences and insights, even when they don't fit neatly into conventional framework. Perhaps most significantly, you discover a new capacity for authentic spiritual communion. Having released relationships based on spiritual diminishment, competition, bypassing, narcissism, consumerism, or condemnation, you create space for connections that reflect what Whitman called the kelson of creation's love, a love that celebrates rather than constrains each soul's unique expression. These authentic spiritual connections don't require you to be less than you are, to compete, to pretend, to worship human intermediaries, to constantly seek the next experience, or to judge others. They allow for the mutual witnessing of each person's divine nature, while honoring the mystery of each individual path. The practical wisdom Whitman offers for navigating life after you've created these new boundaries centers on cultivating what he called the equanimity of things, a balanced perspective that neither demonizes those you've released nor doubts your right to create necessary distance. First, resist the temptation to vilify people who exhibited the 6 relationship patterns we've discussed. Remember that they're acting from their own limited understanding and capacity, often unconsciously. Maintain compassion, even as you maintain boundaries. Second, be prepared for periods of loneliness or doubt as you transition away from familiar relationship patterns. Trust that this space is temporary and necessary for new, more authentic connections to emerge. Whitman often celebrated solitude as a place of communion with the deeper self. I exist as I am, that is enough. Third, actively seek new relationships that reflect the qualities of authentic spiritual communion. Mutual respect for each person's direct relationship with the divine, freedom from comparison or competition, emotional honesty alongside spiritual awareness, recognition of each person's spiritual autonomy, commitment to depth over novelty, and expansive inclusivity rather than judgment. These relationships rarely announce themselves dramatically. They tend to develop quietly through genuine resonance. Finally, practice what Whitman modeled so powerfully: the ability to find communion not just with select individuals, but with the broader human family, and indeed, all of existence. In Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, Whitman speaks to readers across time. I am with you, you men and women of a generation, or ever so many generations hence. This expanded communion doesn't replace the need for healthy boundaries in specific relationships, but it provides a larger context of connection that sustains us through transitions in our immediate circle. The common pitfalls to avoid in this process of compassionate release include several subtle but significant traps. First, beware of overcorrection, swinging from unhealthy accommodation to rigid rejection. Creating spiritual boundaries doesn't mean becoming harshly judgmental of others' spiritual expressions or paths. Maintain Whitman's generous spirit that could honor each person's journey while still protecting his own spiritual integrity. Second, avoid the trap of spiritual isolation, using discernment about unhealthy relationships as an excuse to withdraw from authentic communion altogether. Whitman never advocated spiritual solipsism. He celebrated connection with every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. The goal is better connections, not no connection. Third, be cautious about creating a new identity around spiritual boundary setting. Some people become so focused on identifying and avoiding the 6 types we've discussed that they develop a rigid, fearful approach to relationships. They see potential spiritual diminishers or narcissists everywhere, missing opportunities for growth that sometimes come through challenging interactions. Finally, resist the temptation to evangelize others about their need to set similar boundaries. Each person must discover their own right timing for this discernment. Whitman knew that spiritual wisdom cannot be forced, but must be realized individually. Not anyone else can travel that road for you. The integration of body and soul that Whitman celebrated offers a powerful framework for understanding what authentic spiritual relationships actually feel like in our embodied experience. Unlike the 6 constraining relationship patterns we've discussed, genuine spiritual communion creates distinct bodily sensations that serve as trustworthy guidance. In authentic spiritual connection, the body typically feels more relaxed, the breath deepens naturally, and physical tension diminishes. There's often a pleasant warmth in the chest and solar plexus, and a general sense of energetic expansion rather than contraction. Authentic spiritual communion creates what Whitman called the feeling of health, the full noon trill, the song of me rising from bed and meeting the sun. In contrast, the 6 types of constraining relationships often produce bodily discomfort, tension in the shoulders or jaw, shallow breathing, a sense of pressure or constriction in the chest or throat, subtle anxiety in the belly, or unusual fatigue after interactions. The body's wisdom speaks clearly if we learn to listen. Beyond these physical signals, authentic spiritual relationships have distinctive energetic qualities. There's a sense of mutual freedom, each person celebrating rather than constraining the other's unique expression. There's a natural rhythm of connection and autonomy, coming together and moving apart, without anxiety or control. There's an atmosphere of generosity rather than scarcity, as if spiritual gifts multiply rather than diminish when shared. And perhaps most importantly, there's a palpable sense of the sacred made ordinary, the divine recognized not as some distant abstraction, but as the living reality between and within both people. This is what Whitman pointed to when he wrote, "And I say to any man or woman, let your soul stand cool and composed before a million universes." In authentic spiritual communion, souls stand together, cool and composed, witnessing the infinite without diminishment, competition, bypassing, narcissism, consumption, or condemnation, simply present together to the wonder of existence. As we draw this exploration to a close, I'm reminded of the essential paradox Whitman embodied in his understanding of spiritual relationships. He recognized the need for discernment in our immediate circle, what we've explored as the compassionate release of the 6 types of constraining relationships, while simultaneously maintaining a cosmic communion with all beings across time and space. This apparent contradiction resolves when we understand that healthy boundaries in specific relationships actually enable, rather than prevent, the larger communion Whitman celebrated. When we're no longer depleted by spiritual diminishment, competition, bypassing, narcissism, consumerism, or condemnation, we have more capacity for the expansive love that embraces all. The abandonment Whitman advocates isn't abandonment of people, but of relationship patterns that diminish our spirit's authentic expression. It's an abandonment in service of a truer communion. In Song of the Open Road, Whitman writes, "Allons, whoever you are, come travel with me. Traveling with me, you find what never tires." This is his invitation to authentic spiritual companionship, not the tired patterns of spiritual constraint, but the eternally fresh experience of souls witnessing each other's divine nature. The journey toward this authentic spiritual communion isn't always easy. It requires courage to create new boundaries, patience to weather periods of transition, and discernment to recognize genuinely nourishing connections. But the reward is what Whitman called the amplitude of time, a spaciousness in your spiritual life that allows for true expansion. And in this expansion, you discover what may be Whitman's greatest insight about spiritual relationships, that in releasing connections based on constraint, you don't end up with less love, but with more. A love no longer confined to familiar patterns, but free to express its boundless nature. In the words of Whitman himself, the soul is always beautiful. It appears more, or it appears less. It comes or it lags behind. It comes from its embowered garden and looks pleasantly on itself and encloses the world. May your soul, freed from constraining relationships, emerge from its embowered garden to both celebrate itself and enclose the world in a more expansive embrace. If these reflections on spiritual relationships have touched that quiet place in your heart that has long sought expression, if you've recognized yourself in the struggles I've described or glimpsed new possibilities for more authentic spiritual communion, I invite you to join me on this continuing journey. I offer this invitation not as someone who has mastered these principles, but as a fellow traveler who, like you, is learning to navigate the complex terrain of spiritual relationships with greater awareness. By subscribing to this channel, you'll gain access not just to weekly reflections on spiritual relationships inspired by Whitman's timeless wisdom, but also to a community where your unique spiritual journey is honored in all its complexity. I understand the particular challenge of feeling spiritually constrained by relationships that otherwise bring value to your life. This channel exists to remind you that you're not alone in that experience. When you subscribe, you become part of a circle of souls who, like you, are seeking to balance compassion for others with fidelity to their own spiritual truth. They too are learning the art of creating boundaries without building walls, of releasing without rejecting, of standing in their spiritual sovereignty while remaining open to authentic connection. I've dedicated years to exploring how Whitman's understanding of spiritual relationships can be applied in our complex modern life, not as an academic exercise, but as a lived practice that continues to transform my own relationship pattern. Each week I share insights, practices, and reflections that have emerged from this ongoing exploration. This conversation about spiritual relationships and the 6 types of people Whitman would advise us to compassionately release is just the beginning. If it has resonated with you, I invite you to subscribe and continue this journey together. Thank you for your presence here today. Your attention is a gift I don't take lightly, and I honor the unique spiritual journey that brought you to this moment of connection.